Welcome, I'm Maciej, and I would like to present our developments into a new class of systems that we call neural graph databases. We published this at one of the recent Learning on Graph conferences. So graph databases are a well-known class of systems where we are managing, processing, analyzing huge graph datasets. So the data model that we use in many or even most of graph databases is the so-called labeled property graph data model, where the graph consists of, as usual, vertices and edges that we can use to model, for example, people and then their interactions or anything else. But in addition to that, we also have rich data attached to these vertices and edges. So this could be properties. For example, a vertex or an edge can have properties like title, which is a string, number of authors. So if we use our graph to model, for example, papers, and edges between these vertices are citations between papers, then like a vertex would have properties like, again, title, number of authors, number of equations, maybe something more. And we could also have labels, which are sort of ways to categorize our data. So, for example, a paper could be a conference proceeding paper or a tech report, etc., etc. Right? So we have a lot of rich data attached to these graph datasets in our labeled property graph model. We use graph databases in a plethora of domains in ranging from social sciences, engineering, biology, chemistry, and a lot of others. And that's why there is quite so many of them. So we have a huge landscape of systems that are implementing these graph capabilities. We use in many of them, we use the LPG model. And that's why these systems are an important class of systems. At the same time, in parallel, what we have been seeing in the graph computing domain as a whole has been the ongoing evolution in graph machine learning. Right? So we now have tools such as graph neural networks that we can use to enhance our graph reasoning capabilities by combining these graphs with neural networks. Right? So this domain, as we all know, exploded in the last couple of years, and some example highlight designs are a way to produce or to plan the chip design in a more effective way with graphs and graph neural networks. We have also been using GNNs. Graph neural networks have also been used for guiding mathematical discoveries. And also we have the established AlphaFold model for predicting shapes of proteins. Again, the underlying mechanism is a certain class of graph neural networks. Right, so how a graph neural network works is that we have some input samples. These are going to be, for example, our vertices with some connections, right? But the sample is actually a vertex here. It has some accompanying feature vector. That's our sample. So this vertex can be used to model again a paper, but maybe it could be used to model for also a picture, and now or anything else. And now in a GNN, in a so-called single GNN layer, we are first conducting a so-called graph-related operation, such as graph convolution. So here we are actually taking a look at the neighbors of this one vertex in this one sample, and we are, for example, feature fetching and summing and averaging the feature vectors of these neighbors, or maybe applying some other aggregation operation, right? So in a single layer of GNNs, we are first doing this aggregation, then we apply some neural operation. For example, we run these feature vectors of these samples through an MLP, and finally, we apply some nonlinearity, right? Then we repeat. And we use this pipeline of GNNs, this basic pipeline, for computing, for example, classification or regression over vertices, right? So we would like to predict some scores or some categories of a vertex that, again, can be a paper, can be a picture, can maybe also a molecule, like we can see here. We can also use GNNs to run classification or regression over individual edges. So we might be willing to consider edges as the first class citizens and do some predictions for edges themselves, but also the whole graphs, right? We could also run classification or regression of whole graphs to, for example, predict a kind of molecule we are dealing with. So now we have these two worlds. We have on one hand graph databases with these huge graphs, with these labeled property graph model, which is the underlying model that we have there. And on the other hand, we have this world of graph neural networks where we have pure graph structure and basically different types of prediction tasks like classification and regression that we are running on these graphs. And now really the fundamental question behind, the driving question behind this whole project was to understand how to marry these two. Because obviously we would like to somehow combine them to have a combination of their capabilities at hand. But it was not very clear at the very beginning. And the main challenge in this whole design was to really understand how to merge these two worlds conceptually. And really the answer to this is that yes, there is a neat way to think about GNN workloads and GNNs in general together with graph databases, and we do it through the perspective of, again, the LPG, the labeled property graph data model. So basically the way to approach this marriage of these two worlds of designs is to take a look at the workloads that we have in the GNNs and think about how do we now run these workloads in the context of labeled property graph. And what it turns out that basically node, edge, or graph classification becomes basically the label prediction within the graph database context. And so for example, here we may want to have some new labels, right? So let's say we have this paper here that, so this vertex model is a paper that is basically a conference proceeding paper. And now we may want to predict some other label for this paper. Or maybe there's a new vertex that we are inserting into our graph database, and we would like to predict the labels for this new vertex, right? So basically we can use GNNs and their capabilities for solving the classification problems over a graph as a label prediction problem in the context of graph databases. And similarly for regression. So now the GNN regression tasks become basically property prediction. Because now what may happen is that we may want to also predict a property or set of properties for this new vertex here, or we may want to predict some other properties that we already have for already existing vertices in our graph database. And basically for this, we would use the node, edge, or graph regression capabilities of a GNN and establish it as the property prediction problem in the graph database. Right? And now what is really important, okay, how do we actually do it, right? Because yes, we have these graphs, we have these datasets, these LPG datasets, we now know how to think about GNN workloads and GNN capabilities within these graph database datasets. But how do we actually do it? Because what we basically want to have as the final outcome, as the final design, is some way to solve these novel prediction tasks while harnessing all this information that we have in these labeled property graphs. And basically the answer here is that we need the right encoder. We need the right way to encode these labeled property graphs so that we can take them and feed them into the GNN pipeline to solve prediction tasks. Right? And for this, we introduce the encoder that we call LPG2vec, which, as the name suggests, basically is going to vectorize our labeled property graphs. Right? So here we have some example of smaller example of the LPG graph dataset. What we are doing in LPG2vec is basically we are taking all these different properties and labels, etc., and we are vectorizing them. We are basically building feature vectors for all of these different types of data that we can find in a graph database. So in our paper, we have details for how we do it, for example, for strings of text, for numerical properties, for other types of properties. What is important is that each of these different types of data that we have in the LPG graphs, we basically end up converting to a feature vector through the LPG2vec interface. Right, so we take all these feature vectors and then we concatenate them so that we have a single long feature vector assigned to every vertex and every edge. Right, so that means that we are effectively taking this very rich LPG graph that is, again, coming with these properties, with these labels, and we are basically taking all this rich label and property information, making feature vectors out of it, and we are ending up with the barebone graph structure together with the feature vectors that encode all this rich information that we have in our graph database. What we can do then is we can basically take this graph and feed it directly to any existing graph neural network infrastructure such as PyG or DGL and run this framework to get the predictions for our datasets. In the evaluation, we used the Swiss National Supercomputing Center machines, and we basically had one main goal. It was to show that LPG2vec once we apply it to these graphs, it successfully harnesses the label and property information. Basically, that we can use this LPG2VEC to gather and to harness all this rich information that we have in these graphs for the purpose of more accurate predictions. Here in this plot, we are first taking a look at some data for node classification. So we have some nodes in our data set, and we would like to predict something for each of these nodes. And basically, the graph is the Microsoft Knowledge Academic Graph. And that means that this is a graph of papers and authors. And so basically, there are some vertices in this graph that are modeling publications, and we would like to predict the research area of each of these publications. So this is our task here. And now in these plots, on the left side, we can see a small variant of this Microsoft Knowledge Graph, and on the right side there is the other variant, the large variant of this knowledge graph. So we have two types of data sets here, or sorry, two instances of data sets here. And now in each of these plots, on the x-axis, we are comparing a class of neural networks that we are using. So GCN is graph convolutional network, GAT is graph attention networks, and GIN is graph isomorphism network. So these are different types of graph neural networks that we are now using as the driver for making the prediction on these graph database data sets, right? And then we have the test accuracy in the y-axis, so the higher the better. We are doing the classification task here, and the color is basically illustrating how much of this LPG data we are harnessing, we are using, right? So the non-baseline is basically just a bare bone graph structure and basically no LPG encoder, right? So this is where we don't really use LPG at all. Then the darker the color, the more information from these labels and properties we are harnessing through LPG2VEC into the final prediction scope, right? So we are taking more and more of this LPG graph through our LPG2VEC encoder and throwing it into the prediction pot, right? And we can see nicely that basically the more data we use, the better. Right? This is an interesting effect that really shows that LPG2VEC does successfully harness the richness of this information in these graph database datasets and uses them for more powerful predictions. Right, so yes, better accuracy with labels and properties. It is important to use them both, right? So the darker color is basically where we use both labels and properties, and it's coming with the best accuracy. Well, not always, right? So this is actually one specific case here where we can see that the patterns are not that much convincing, and we dug deeper into that thing. What we did basically was because these datasets are very rich, so they have a lot of different types of properties and labels. And now what we did, we analyzed the effects from taking individually all of them, right? So here on the x-axis on this plot, we can see different types of properties, and we are throwing them more and more and more to the final prediction pot and like applying them through our LPG2VEC. And we can see that while for some of them, they are very good for the final accuracy, right? So nearly all of them come with some positive effect, especially the title. There are some, the free ones here, that actually come with detrimental performance. So this performance is worse than the baseline without any of these properties and labels applied, right? And the same on the right side. On the right side, we basically can see that we did even more detailed investigation into pairs of these labels and properties. So here we analyze the effect of what is the final accuracy impact from each pair of labels and properties considered over the baseline where we consider none of them. And again, while we can see that most of these points come with some good positive outcomes, many of them are only negligible ones. Some of them are coming with high, like more distinctive positive outcomes. There are again some pairs that are coming with detrimental outcomes. And that really shows that it is important to also understand your data, because while usually you will benefit more from this rich data that you have in your graph database for the final predictions, you may want to actually make sure that this is really going to happen, because sometimes the accuracy might increase. So in our paper, we have much more data for different data sets that we took from, for example, Neo4j data sets, and you can take a look at all of them in our paper that is available online. Thank you for your attention.